Before we start post-processing our Milky Way shots, I just want to remind you of a few things I said earlier on. So to take a good Milky Way shot, we need to concentrate on the foreground primarily. And with our lens, we need a lens with a large or wide aperture. So we're looking at something roughly at about f2.8 or larger. Now, ISO, we need to crank that all the way to the top. And manual focus, so obviously you have to use manual focus. Autofocus won't be able to work in conditions where it's so dark. All we need to do is look for the infinity sign on our lens when we're focusing and move all the way to infinity. Now, of course, if we arrive early enough when we're shooting, we can take a few shots just to make sure that the stars are actually sharp enough. And if they're a little bit blurry, well, then we can just play with our manual focus slightly, but we shouldn't be too far away from that infinity sign. Now, in terms of shutter speed, we'll be shooting between 20 and 30 seconds, depending on where you are. So again, you should have plenty of time if you turn up early, just to play with those settings and see what works for you. Now, with that all in mind, let's look at the images I shot earlier on in the lavender fields. The first one we see is the brightest exposure, or the exposure we're going to use for the foreground primarily. The next one is actually a black exposure. And now I put my lens cap on here and shot for around 30 seconds. And this is going to be used to reduce some of those hot pixels that we see when we start using long exposures. And we can't really remove hot pixels, but we can reduce them unless we clone stamp them out, which takes a long time. Next, we have the exposure that exposed for the sky here. So this is the same composition as the foreground exposure, but this one we're going to use for the stars only. And lastly, we have this exposure, which is composed mainly of our stars up here. So we're going to use it as a panorama, as I talked about earlier, vertical panorama. And so most of our sky is going to come from this image here. So the first thing we need to do here is make sure our exposures are ready for blending. And to do that, we're going to use matching, just as we've done before. This is our darker exposure for the foreground. And if I bring up the shadows, you see we're just brightening up a little bit, and I can bring up the exposure just a little bit. Now that should make it much easier to blend in with our brighter exposure, where I'm going to bring down the highlights. And we're just going to blend this in manually. Now for this exposure, I'm going to bring it down a tiny bit, but bring up the shadows. Now I'm bringing the exposure down so that we can darken this hut here and the horizon. But since I'm bringing up the shadows, I'm not losing the detail that we had in our foreground. So I can bring up shadows a little bit more. And now the reason why we shot this foreground exposure, as I mentioned, is to try and capture more information in there without having too much noise. So if you look at the darker exposure, we've brought up the shadows and you can see there's huge amounts of color noise all in the foreground here. And this is what we want to avoid. But by shooting at a longer exposure for the foreground, we've got a foreground with pretty much no color noise. It's not perfect, of course, and it's a little bit blurry because we shot at f2.8, but it's a huge improvement on this initial image. When we're finished with this exposure, we go down to the other sky exposure and we do exactly the same thing. So we bring up our shadows and we bring up our exposure to 40. So we're making sure these two exposures are as close as possible in terms of brightness, so we can match them up smoothly when it comes to blending the panorama. Now this, as you already know, is the tail end of the Milky Way. This is the second composition I chose in the video. So to shoot the galactic center, we'd have to be on the other side of the building. But I went for this composition because when I got to that shot, as you can see by this image, there was a lot of cloud which was blocking the galactic center. So it didn't quite make for a good example for this tutorial. But we can still add contrast and vibrancy to the tail end of the Milky Way to make it stand out. And we do that by going up to this brush sign here, and it's called an adjustment brush. And we click on that. And now I want you to use the same settings as me. So we're going to bring up our exposure to +55, our highlights to +12, and clarity all the way to +100. And clarity will give our sky much more contrast. Now make sure the brush is nice and big so we can change the size here at the bottom. And I'm just going to run the brush down the middle of the sky here, like that. And now I'm going to do the same for the other darker exposure, right down the middle, like that. And it has to be in the same area so that it matches this exposure. And now when that's done, I select all of the layers and click on the hand button here and choose lens corrections and remove chromatic aberration. I'm not going to enable profile corrections here because often that brightens up the edges of the frame and brings out a lot of noise. So we just want to leave this as it is for Milky Way shots. And now I'm just going to choose open images. So I'm not opening as smart objects this time. Now we have our 4 exposures in Photoshop. We've got the foreground exposure here and this dark exposure, and then the exposure we're going to blend in with the foreground exposure, which exposes for the sky. So the first thing I'm going to do is choose the move tool, click on the image and drag over to this window. Then I'm going to hold down shift with the mouse button over the image and then let go of the mouse button. Then I let go of shift. And I'm going to do the same with this darker exposure. Just drag it over and drop it onto the image. And now I can close these windows. I'm now going to drag this black exposure on top, and I'm going to have the base exposure on the bottom there, which is exposing for the foreground. So I can just make this darker exposure visible. I'm going to create a mask on this exposure, and all I'm going to do to blend in these exposures is just to paint manually. So I've got a black paintbrush, 100% opacity, and it's a soft brush, and I'm just painting in this foreground exposure. Just gently painting it in. Now there's no way to blend the exposures with luminosity masks in this example. So if we want to do a really clean job of this, we have to zoom right in, choose our paintbrush, make it nice, small, and just start painting in. And so this is going to take a little bit of time. So I'm going to fast forward the video so you don't get bored. So stick around. So with that done, I'm going to show you a really cool technique for reducing the hot pixels in a scene. Now, like I said before, we can't really remove hot pixels unless we go through and clone out each individual one. And we can do that, and I have done that before, but it takes a seriously long time. Now, when it comes to Milky Way shots, there's usually a little bit of noise anyway, so a lot of hot pixels are actually hidden within that noise. But let me just show you what the hot pixels look like. So we have this brighter area here and this green area here. If we make this layer invisible, watch what happens. You'll see we have the corresponding colors on this darker exposure in the exact same place, and we've got some in the left here. So the best way to try and reduce the impact of these hot pixels is by opening up a levels layer, creating a clipping mask so it sticks only to that hot pixel layer, and then bring in the highlights all the way along, and then bring in the midtones along so that we reduce any midtones, and we're just trying to make a really contrasting look here. And that should just about do it. Now we've really exaggerated those areas, and to reduce the hot pixels, all we do is select the hot pixel layer, go to our blend modes, and go down to difference. And now we've blended the hot pixels. So that's before and that's after. And you'll see it's kind of made it dark and just lessened the impact, and we can always bring down the opacity a little bit just to make it a bit less obvious. Now I'm going to zoom out and zoom into the sky here because we also have hot pixels in the sky in some places. Let me bring up the opacity of this layer to make it more obvious. So if we zoom into this area, you'll see the hot pixels have gone black. But we don't really need it in the sky because the sky has stars in it. So hot pixels generally mingle with the stars, so it doesn't stand out too much. So all we need to do is create a mask on the hot pixels layer, choose our paintbrush, make sure it's big, bring our opacity of this layer back down to around 60% again, and just mask out the hot pixel layer in the sky. And that should just about do it. So now we've essentially blended these two exposures and reduced some of these hot pixels. So we're ready to create the panorama. We're going to do this in a very destructive way. We're going to flatten all of the images. So I'm just going to right click on any of the layers and just choose flatten image and make sure that's unlocked. Then I'm going to unlock this one and I'm going to say file, save, and I'm going to call this sky and just press save. Then I'll go over to the other window and do exactly the same thing. Save as, and I'm going to call it foreground. With these two windows saved, we can go to File, Automate, and Photo Merge. And this is where we're going to blend in the panorama. And we choose Add Open Files because our windows are already open in Photoshop, and we just press OK. So Photoshop has blended the exposures, but not very well. There's a lot of perspective distortion here, so we're going to have to clean it up a bit. And we do that by going to Layer and Merge Layers. Then I'm going to zoom out just a little bit and press Command and T or Control and T, and that brings up our transformation selections. Then I'm going to right click and choose one of these options. I'm going to go with perspective because we're going to correct the perspective distortion. And I take the right hand part of the image here and just drag it out. And you see we're stretching out the image and making the sky more impactful and reducing the impact of the foreground there. And at the same time, I'm going to grab the bottom ones and just bring the foreground in a little bit, because I feel like the foreground's a little bit too big and kind of in your face. Now let's just drag this along so we can see what we're doing. Now with that done, I think the image here is going to be a little bit narrow, so we can right click and choose Distort. We can select one of the squares on the side and just drag it out a bit. And that'll just fatten up the image slightly. And again, I'm going to drag this up a tiny bit. And one more time, I think the foreground's still a little bit too big, so I'm going to go for perspective again, and I'm going to pull that in just a tiny bit. And then we can press OK. And of course now we have to crop the frame, so I'm going to choose the crop tool, have delete cropped pixels unselected so we could go back and redo any changes we might have made. And we're just going to bring in the photo. Bring this down all the way to roughly where you see that satellite or shooting star in the sky. And I'm going to bring this up too. And you'll notice the center part of the image is right on the house, and that's exactly where we want it to be. And then I press OK, make the image a little bit bigger. And actually I think I'm just going to crop the bottom part of the image a tiny bit too. Roughly to, let's say, about here. I think the frame looks a little bit narrow, and that's a little bit of an improvement. That's good. So now we've basically stitched our panorama, and I just want to make sure that horizon is straight, and according to my ruler tool, it is perfectly straight. So with these done, I can actually close the other two windows. There's no need to have them open. Now we need to start bringing out some contrast and color in the image. And I want to show you one really useful thing that we can do, especially in Milky Way shots, to bring out a little bit of color and contrast. I like to open up a new layer and choose a foreground color, which is usually a pretty dark blue. Let's say around about this type of blue. We don't want it to be too vibrant. Then I go to the paint bucket tool and just paint right on the image there. And on this layer, I change the blend mode to soft light. And then I bring the opacity all the way down. So we're looking at around about 18% there. And that's the before and after. You see, we've added some lovely blue tones to the frame. And I've brought the opacity now down to about 12%. So it's not too much. And not only does it add blue to the sky, it also brings out some coloring in the lavender field. So let's break our frame down to two different parts. We've got the foreground here and the sky, and we're going to edit those separately. Now to edit this separately, firstly, I'm just going to add some contrast into the sky here. We want it dark and striking. And that looks like a pretty good job. Now remember, if the colors become a little bit oversaturated when you use contrast adjustments, we can change the blend mode of that layer, of the contrast layer, to luminosity. And that means we keep any luminosity changes we make, like the contrast adjustments, but it doesn't affect the color. Then we can bring down the opacity if that effect's a little bit strong. We can choose the paintbrush and make it a large paintbrush at 100% opacity and just paint out the foreground. We don't want that too dark. So now we've darkened the sky and added a little bit more contrasting kick to it. Now I'm going to add more brightness to the general image because it's a little bit dark. So I'm just going to open up a levels layer, as you see, and I'm just going to bring the highlight slider along. We don't want the lights on the horizon to be too bright because they're already a little bit overexposed. So I'm going to make sure my paintbrush is selected with a black foreground, choose a 50% brush opacity, and I'm just going to paint over that area just slightly so it's a little bit darker. And that's the before and after. It's a nice improvement. Now let's see if we can create a nice mood booster by deepening the midtones in general, so darkening the scene as I've already done before, and bringing up the shadows. And it just softens the frame. I think that's a little bit of an improvement, but I'm going to bring down the opacity quite significantly to around 50%. So it's just softening the shadows, especially in the foreground. Now I'm going to do a couple of destructive things. And the first one is I'm going to dodge and burn in the foreground, but I'm going to do so using the typical dodge and burn tools. And to do that, we have to press Command, Option, Shift and E, or Control, Alt, Shift and E, and we create a merged layer. Now I'm choosing the dodge tool. I've got my range set to midtones and exposure to 10%, which are the settings that I usually have most of the time. And now I'm just going to paint in the foreground just to brighten up some of the midtones. And we want to make sure that we're also doing the areas to the left here and to the right. We're just giving the lavender fields a little bit more definition. So there you go, we're adding a bit more life to those lavender fields that I need to do down here too. And that should just about do it. We don't want it to be too bright. We just want it to be a definable path so people can see the textures and colors in the foreground. And we can always just bring up another levels layer, just bring that along just to brighten up the foreground, bring along the midtones and then the shadows. You know, exactly like we were doing before when we bring up the shadows just to soften it. But at the same time, we're bringing along the highlights to give it just a little bit more kick and definition. So I'm going to press Command and I or Control and I to invert that mask. Then I'm going to select a white paintbrush with my opacity set to 100. And I'm just going to paint in those changes. And just to make sure I don't brighten up the horizon too much, I'm going to choose a black brush and just paint that out along there. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select this top layer and again press Command, Option, Shift and E or Control, Alt, Shift and E on a PC and merge those layers, and I'm going to right click and make this into a smart object. And now we can open up Adobe Camera Raw just to add a little bit more local contrast to the foreground. So I'm going to go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and that's why I converted the layer to a smart object, because we can undo these changes later on. So I'm just going to bring clarity along just a little bit, so plus 24, and press OK. And this is just for the foreground here. I'm going to create a mask and a black brush, make it nice and big, and I'm going to paint out any changes that the Adobe Camera Raw did in the sky. So with that masked out, here's the before and after. Just a little bit of local contrast just to give the foreground a bit of kick. Now again, I think we need to deepen the sky a little bit, just darken it because it's a little bit too bright. So I'm just bringing down the midtones and shadows in a curves layer and bringing up the highlights. And I'm going to mask out the foreground. And if we feel the sky's a little bit dark, we can just bring down the opacity of that layer. So there's the before and after. And now, as you can see, the image is just a little bit dark. So I'm going to open up a levels layer and I'm going to bring the highlight slider along just a little bit. And that's bringing some life into the scene. Now we don't want too much life in the foreground. I think it's getting a little bit bright, so we can reduce the opacity of this brush to 50%. Make sure it's a black foreground and just paint some of those changes out. And maybe we can go over that again. So there we go. That's a big improvement. And I'm just going to make sure we go over the horizon as well. We don't want to brighten that too much. Now to finish, I'm just going to create a vignette in the same way that you've seen previously. I'm going to open up the curves layer, bring down the midtones a little bit, bring up the shadows a tiny bit, and press Command and I or Control and I. Choose a paintbrush, set the foreground to white, make it nice and big, and just do around some of these edges here. Make sure the opacity of the brush is at 100%. And just painting in just around some of these areas. And here we don't want to go over the main area with the stars in it. We just want to go around it. So that's the before and after. And if we want to reduce that, we can reduce the opacity as always. And so I think at about 40%, 45%, that looks pretty good. And so I'm going to group all of these changes and show you a before and after. So this is the image we started off, which was already quite a nice image, but its colors and contrasts were a little bit flat and the Milky Way didn't look very impactful as well. And after all of our changes, this is the final result. We've got a nice strong Milky Way in the sky, and we've got some decent colors and some nice definition in the foreground. Believe it or not, I never like to apply noise removal to any of my Milky Way shots. The main reason being is that when you apply noise removal, it usually removes beautiful details and textures. So if we did so and we applied it to the foreground, we're going to lose some of those nice textures and it's going to become blurry. The other problem is we can apply it to the sky, but I don't think noise in a Milky Way shot in the sky is a big deal. You know, there's so many stars in the good sky anyway, that they all kind of just merge and blend into one. I've printed Milky Way shots at really large sizes with no noise removal, and it was absolutely fine. I'm not one of these photographers who worries about the tiniest little bit of noise. You know, traditionally in film photography, grain was kind of standard, issue. We accepted it for what it was, but now because we have digital photography and we have Photoshop, we try to look for absolute perfection in our images. And most of the time it isn't really necessary. It's kind of wasted time and effort. So for me, I like to keep some grain in there. I like to keep some noise in there because it really doesn't matter that much. But it's entirely up to you. If you do want to remove noise, I highly recommend Topaz Denoise. That for me is the best one on the market, better than Nik and certainly better than the native noise removal in Photoshop.